one of the better books that I read last year was this book called Letter to the American Church by Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas' book is really, as the Epoch Times puts it, a clarion call to the churches. It's a clarion call to the pulpits to stand up for what is right and expose what is wrong, not only in the churches, but also in American society, to expose error and to expose philosophies that are against America, that are exactly attacking the ideals of Christianity. And there are a lot of them. Of course, Marxist and cultural Marxism. We're going through a cultural revolution right now. And all of that, of course, Eric Metaxas covers in his book. But I was particularly interested in the fact that Ian Cain wrote in the Epoch Times a short review, not only of the book, but particularly of the movie. This has now been turned into a movie. So, Letter to the American Church, and it's a call to preachers and people in the pulpits to get their act together and expose what is wrong. So here's how Ian Cain begins his article. Many Americans consider the recent COVID-19 emergency powers that the government had enacted to be downright tyrannical in nature, and I am one of those. If you're like most people, 2020 was a year that you would like to forget. However, if we look back and investigate it, we'll notice some interesting details. For example, in California, Ian tells us, I distinctly remember that all churches were closed down. However, establishments such as strip clubs and liquor stores stayed open. Apparently, churches, long known to be central hubs for communities to draw upon for spiritual and mental health and other needs, they were considered non-essential. I want to stop right here and note that's exactly what I experienced to be the case. I don't live in California, but I have family who does. And they told me, right, matter of fact, Imperial Beach, California, just south of Coronado Island, there the small congregation of the Church of Christ was meeting, but they could not meet. And then when they did meet, they told them they couldn't sing. And if they did sing, that is the government, this is what the author of the article is going to get into here. When they did sing, they had a public snitch system that was in place where the neighbors heard them singing, report them to the authorities. And so the author of the article goes on to say, when a small number of Christian activists finally pressed the issue, some churches were allowed to open their doors, albeit with restricted days and hours. However, Governor Gavin Newsom passed a measure that forbade churchgoers from singing and chanting while attending services. And many found these types of sweeping restrictions discriminatory, I say tyrannical, but leaders within the Christian community, here's what Eric Metaxas tells us, and here's what the author of the article tells us, largely silent. Isn't that shocking? After seeing the insightful new documentary, Letter to the American Church, based upon this book, the reaction starts to make sense. The film is based on the best-selling book of the same name by the author and radio host Eric Metaxas. The film compares and contrasts many of the issues that afflict the Western world today, beginning with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early 1930s. Now let me add this in this particular place right here in the article. So many people being misled by universities and the collegiate professorships and the mainstream media. They want to classify Nazism as some far-right movement. You know what? That is how effective Vladimir Lenin has been to brainwash American people. That's how effective the Mao Tse-tungs have been to brainwash, not Mao Tse-tung himself, but communist people such as Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin. That's how effective they have been to brainwash the American people, because when you're standing in communism, which is on the far left-hand side of the spectrum, if we're going to consider freedom, far left of the spectrum, totalitarianism, when you stand over there and you look to your right, you're going to see Nazism. But if you stand in the center, if you stand in the constitutional center of that spectrum, Nazism is not on the right. Nazism is on the left. And the reason that so many people today in the mainstream media and the collegiate atmosphere, in the collegiate classroom, and the brown shirts that are marching right out of the collegiate classrooms and the professorship say that Well, Nazism is on the right is because they have been brainwashed by the Vladimir Lenins of the world. Nazism represents a totalitarian, lesser perhaps in degree than communism, but a totalitarian rule. So on February 1933, February 1, 2 days after Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany, a young German preacher by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer delivered a radio address titled Führer Principle, that is the leadership principle. Leadership principle. Since Germany was morally and economically defeated after World War I, Hitler presented himself as a messianic figure who could lift up the German people. However, there was a caveat. The Führer's every wish and command was to be obeyed as if they were divine decrees, just as we saw with the government coming in cracking down regarding COVID-19 restrictions on the churches. Now, Bonhoeffer saw through this veiled seizure of totalitarian power, and his speech demonstrated what was wrong with the ideas set forth by Hitler. So Metaxas tells us in his book, he describes what ultimately happened on that particular fateful day. That was February 1, 1933. Quote, it was a speech that challenged the idea of what a leader, a Führer, should be, and what it means to be a godly leader. That speech boldly and directly challenged Hitler and his new position as Führer. Now, before Dietrich could finish the speech, the radio signal was cut off. That was February 1, 1933. So get the timeline. Now we move to the end of February 27th. Now I'm recording this on the 28th, so it's a day after the day of 1933, when happened was the Reichstag fire, an event in which the German equivalent of the United States Capitol, that's the Reichstag, was set ablaze. Its timing was very interesting. Although the fire was blamed on a random Dutch madman, Hitler and the Nazi Party used the event, which many believe to be a false flag, to enact sweeping emergency powers that allowed them to bypass the German parliament. Note what you have here. Let me just stop here and add this. Note what you have. You have chaos created by the left, and then they're going to come in, that is by the government authorities creating the chaos, and then they're going to come in with a solution. That's the pincer strategy that is well known by communist dictators and so also Nazi dictators as well. That is, government totalitarian controllers create a situation, and then they come in with the emergency powers and a strong arm of government to settle, because people are going to say, we've got to have some kind of peace and order here. Now, do we see that happening in America? Do you see that happening in America? Absolutely. Unleashed on America right now, Joe Biden has unleashed up to 10 million. This does not include the illegals who are here previous to Biden's administration. Up to 10 million new illegal aliens who are murdering, raping, plundering, destroying all over the country. You see it every day on the news. What's happening? This is the Reichstag fire. That's what's happening. So we'll see emergency powers. And did Joe Biden ask for power? Oh, yeah, that's exactly what he asked for. He asked for power. See, he's exactly like Hitler. Hitler immediately took control of the media's narrative with the goal of instilling fear into anyone who dared object to the Nazi Party's subsequent campaign of state-sponsored terrorism. Do we have state-sponsored terrorism today? Absolutely we do. Black Lives Matter, state-sponsored. How do we know? Well, oh yeah, they're right. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, bailed people out of jail that were involved in the Black Lives Matter riots, burning down government buildings back in 2020. Government officials from the Democratic Party never brought these people to justice. They didn't want to do that. That was unleashing exactly what Hitler did. And so creating all of these crises in order to bring about emergency. That's state-sponsored terrorism. How also state-sponsored terrorism going on in America? Biden has broken down the border completely. There's no border. And they all come in here, and now they're creating chaos in America. Crime is uncontrolled. Well, there's much more to be said for that story, but of course, in order to consolidate his power, Hitler had to bring the German church under his complete control. And here's where I get really interested, because I'm a preacher in the Church of Christ in Iowa Park. And here we have exactly the same type of thing. The German church was brought under his complete control. A pro-Nazi German church was suddenly formed. And while those who opposed it, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they were part of what was called the Confessing Church. So the Confessing Church argued that the ultimate authority of man rested in God's hands, not in those of a single human being such as Hitler. It's exactly right. Bonhoeffer was exactly on target. The ultimate authority rests in God's hands, and we must obey God rather than men. So as Metaxas explains, among Germany's roughly 18, now get these figures, this is, to me, this is astounding, and it is reflective of what we have in America now. 18,000 Protestant pastors, preachers, 3,000 were pro-Nazi. That is, they were simply pro-communist. Nazism and communism are in the same bed. Totalitarianism. 3,000 were, out of the 18,000, were pro-Nazi. That leaves 15,000. Another 3,000 were anti-Nazi. That is, they spoke out. Did they take to the streets and start trying to burn down things? No. They simply got on the radio, such as I'm doing now, podcasting, saying this is absolutely out of control, and it is something that we need to oppose and teach people about it. 3,000 pro-Nazi, 3,000 the Confessing Church. But there were 18,000 preachers. That means that's only 6,000 accounted for. What happened? We have 12,000 people that occupied the pulpit that had influence in the churches. 12,000 pastors, as they're called, chose to sit things out on the sidelines despite the obvious moral and theological threat to the principles of the Christian faith. Adolf Hitler opposes the Christian faith. Joe Biden opposes the Christian faith. And what's happening is reflecting exactly what happened in Germany. Metaxas draws a direct parallel to the strange sense of apathy that pervades the American church today. Why has that happened? Well, that takes another podcast to talk about it. He also states, this is back to Metaxas, that part of the problem lies in the failure of modern Christian leaders to realize, to see what's happening, that cultural Marxism has infiltrated many American churches. Communism. Many of the ideas of cultural Marxism are so prevalent these days, they're intrinsically atheistic, diametrically opposed to the basic tenets of Christianity, let alone any other religion such as Judaism or Islam. Here's what Charlie Kirk, founder of and CEO of Turning Point USA, tells us. Marxists must destroy the family, religion, and property. That's it. They're focused on those three things: the family, religion, and property. So, Kirk says, they must destroy people's connection to the divine. They must destroy the connection to the nuclear family. They must destroy the ability to own your own things, your own stuff. Do we see that? That's almost like reading right off the Black Lives Matter website. That is, destroy the nuclear family. That's like reading exactly what happened with Gavin Newsom in California and around the country with the COVID restrictions. Destroy Christianity. You know that is the case. It's not simply because they're a danger, not people that are in danger of spreading COVID-19, because the bars stayed open, pornographic houses stayed open, but those that were not considered essential businesses, they were closed. That tells you that it's not about COVID-19, not about spreading diseases. It's about absolute totalitarian control. So Kirk goes on to describe how Hitler similarly crushed the authentic Protestant church, installed a Nazi-controlled institution in its stead. Similar to how the state always replaces the church in any communist-controlled country. So you could say, well, you go to China, they have churches there, but they're state-controlled. That is, they are going to tell you what to preach and what you cannot preach, such as they'll send a letter out, perhaps, to the churches saying, April 15th is coming up, and you can't say anything about politics because, after all, you have attacked. Oh, no, that's America. Oh, that's America, right? Yeah. No, well, some things like that's going on in China too, isn't it? Hitler attacked the idea of the family. He encouraged community-based snitching for the Nazi Party, and he seized and destroyed the citizenry private property. Do we see that going on? Absolutely. So the film, based upon Metaxas's book, Pure Economic Marxism Was Never Enough for the Tyrants of the World, a more sinister and frankly effective method of subverting the masses to infiltrate the world's cultures, denigrate their traditions, which is why we see so much anti-family, anti-male, anti-Christian, anti-tradition depravity being disseminated by the powerful institutions that cultural Marxism has usurped, including the legacy media, academia, film and television, and yes, sadly, even churches. I've asked some of these churches to have discussions, to debate publicly on these issues. They don't want to discuss it. They don't want the exposure that an open discussion would shed the light on these things. They don't want that kind of thing. One of the things that the author of this article tells us about the movie says he enjoyed about this thought-provoking production is that although it is an information-heavy, delves into many hot-button topics, it does so in an entertaining and engaging way. Instead of coming off like a dry textbook, the film's brisk pace, coupled with its clearly delivered facts, draw the viewer in. And the film sidesteps a common mistake that documentary filmmakers make. Instead of merely identifying societal problems, this one offers some actual solutions. The film not only throws down the gauntlet, challenges Christians to rise up, take peaceful action, just like Trump said, January 6th, peaceful action in truly meaningful ways, but also provides many actionable takeaways. And so the author of the article, Eon, tells us, I much prefer this method to the ubiquitous hoping and praying comments on social media this day. I hope everything will go well. So German preacher Martin Niemöller of the Confessing Church once issued a poetic, timeless warning. It's especially relevant to American churches today. Time is running out for those who choose to stand on the sidelines. First, he says, and here's what Niemöller said. First, they came for the communist. I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialist. I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out. I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out but me. The time is running out for America, but it's the churches that I am particularly concerned about. I want to add a couple of footnotes here. I hear so many times people say, don't preach politics in the pulpit, stay away from politics. You know what? Isn't it sad that we have allowed academia and the mainstream media to set our agenda and as to what is really to be preached in the pulpit? A Christian view of God and the world recognizes that there is a worldview that is general, that covers everything. It covers world history, society, culture, education, philosophy, art, music, everything, and it covers politics. It covers politics. Jeff Myers and David Noble, in a book called Understanding the Times, says the framework of ideas, beliefs, groups, culture, and how to interpret the world, especially in philosophy, statecraft, and religion. In other words, a God-given view or a God worldview, a God-centered worldview, covers not only the churches, but it covers politics. You need to get up and preach, and your church needs to preach against what's happening and name names. Here's what's happening. Here's what Joe Biden said. Here's what Barack Obama did. You need to put those things out there. And we need to avoid this trap to say, well, that's about politics. James Orr, in his book Christian View of God and the World, says, really, there's only one true and adequate worldview. Only the belief that God actively, moment by moment, rules over all things for his own glory and for the good of his people, only that will suffice. And it brings together not only a view of God, but it also talks about a view of the world, that it was created in God's image. It is not It is not self-perpetuating. It's a view of history that God is controlling and is controlling history. It's a view of man, that man was created in God's image. It's a view of law and statecraft, that the law and the statecraft, that is the science of controlling society, should be done by Christian principles, and that is given to us in Romans chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, that rulers are not a terror to the good work, but to the not to the terror to the good work, but to the evil. Would you have no fear of the power? Do that which is evil. You shall have praise, and then you'll fear the ruler. So 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, same thing. Statecraft, that's managing or governing society. Here's something else to think about. Paul tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he names false teachers, and he tells us regarding those names, he says, I'm warning you regarding Hymenaeus and Alexander that they have overturned the faith of some, saying that the resurrection is past already. Now notice what Paul does. He names the names, speaks out the false teachers, and he tells us what their doctrine is. Why are Christians not standing up and saying, in the pulpit, preachers saying, here's what the government is doing, led by Joe Biden, and they're coming after you, and they're coming after the church? Why are they not doing that? They need to be. Am I saying that's what we need to do full time, 100% of the time? No, not at all. But I tell you what, preachers need to quit running from a Christian worldview, which involves statecraft as well.